Let's get something straight. The Lancaster dropped 608,000 tons of bombs. The Halifax dropped 224,000. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. The Lancaster conducted 156,000 sorties between 1942 and 1945. The Halifax flew 82,773. By any measure of raw bombing tonnage, the Lancaster wins. This is not debatable. This is not a matter of interpretation. The Lancaster was the better bomber. Now, let me tell you the three things the Halifax did that no other British aircraft could. Because here's what the bombing statistics don't tell you. They don't tell you that the Halifax put tanks on the battlefield from the sky, when no other RAF aircraft had the muscle to do it. They don't tell you that Halifax weather reconnaissance flights gave Eisenhower the data to delay D-Day by 24 hours. A decision that may have saved the entire invasion from catastrophe. And they don't tell you that if your bomber got hit over Germany, you were nearly 3 times more likely to survive bailing out of a Halifax than a Lancaster. The Air Ministry kept that last statistic secret from the crews. They were terrified what it would do to Lancaster morale. So why did Britain keep building both aircraft? Why did 6,178 Halifaxes roll off assembly lines when Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the man running Bomber Command, actively lobbied to cancel Halifax production entirely? The answer requires understanding something the tonnage figures obscure. The Halifax wasn't a failed Lancaster. It was a different tool for different jobs. And for those jobs, nothing else would do. But first, we need to talk about the man who tried to kill it. Arthur Harris was not a subtle person. Bomber Harris believed absolutely in area bombing, the doctrine that destroying German cities would break enemy morale and cripple war production. Every bomber that couldn't carry maximum loads, couldn't reach maximum altitude, couldn't survive the gauntlet of searchlights and night fighters, was a bomber wasted. His logic was the logic of industrial efficiency, and he had numbers to back it up. Harris calculated that an average Halifax would drop only 100 tons of bombs in its operational lifetime, compared to 154 tons for a Lancaster, a 54% difference. He proposed a plan to substitute 1,300 Lancasters for the 1,800 Halifaxes scheduled to be built. Simple arithmetic. More bombs on Germany, fewer resources wasted on inferior aircraft. Why maintain separate supply chains, training programs, and maintenance protocols for a bomber that couldn't carry the big bombs, couldn't reach the same altitudes, and, according to his loss rate statistics, couldn't survive as well over the Reich? His reasoning was straightforward. His conclusion was wrong. Here's what Harris didn't mention when he cited those statistics. His numbers were skewed by the dismal performance of the early Merlin-engined Halifax marks. He was using past performance of a sabotage design to condemn the future potential of the aircraft. The Halifax Mark III, the one with the engines its designer had always specified, didn't exist yet in the numbers he was quoting. Harris was killing the patient before the cure could take effect. The roots of Harris's error stretch back to 1936, years before anyone knew his name. That year, the Air Ministry issued specification P.13/36, calling for a twin-engined medium bomber capable of carrying torpedoes for anti-shipping operations or bombs for strategic missions. Handley Page's chief designer, George Falkert, began work on what would eventually become the Halifax. But the original twin-engined concept quickly proved inadequate for the ambitious performance requirements the Air Ministry kept adding. Volkert and his team redesigned the aircraft as a four-engined heavy bomber, submitting revised proposals that eventually became the HP.57, the prototype Halifax. From the very beginning, Volkert knew exactly what engines should power his creation. He wanted the Bristol Hercules. The Hercules was a powerful radial engine, air-cooled, reliable, excellent power-to-weight ratio, simpler to maintain than liquid-cooled alternatives. Air-cooled engines didn't need vulnerable coolant systems that could be punctured by a single piece of shrapnel. They could sustain damage that would doom a liquid-cooled engine and keep running. Volkert had done his calculations. The Hercules was the right engine for a bomber that would be flying into anti-aircraft fire night after night. But the Air Ministry had other ideas. In the labyrinthine bureaucracy of pre-war British aviation procurement, decisions were rarely made on pure engineering merit. Politics mattered. Standardization policies mattered. The Air Ministry's engine standardization policy favored the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same liquid-cooled V-12 that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes and would eventually power Lancasters. The Merlin was an extraordinary engine, arguably the finest piston engine of the war. It was the engine that would win the Battle of Britain. But it was not the engine George Volkert wanted for his bomber. The bureaucrats overruled him anyway. Early production models of the Halifax were powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, which proved inadequate for the aircraft's weight and mission demands. This wasn't Volkert's design failing. This was his design being sabotaged by committee. Men in offices who had never built an aircraft, who had never calculated stress loads or power-to-weight ratios, decided they knew better than the chief designer, who had spent years developing the airframe. The Merlin X engines fitted to the Halifax Mark I and Mark II simply didn't provide enough power at altitude. When loaded with bombs, fuel and defensive ammunition, the early Halifax struggled to climb above 17,000 feet, dangerously low for a bomber facing German night fighters and flak. The aircraft was underpowered, and everyone from squadron commanders to flight engineers knew it. The problems compounded in operation. The Merlin's liquid cooling system required radiators and coolant lines running throughout the engine nacelles. A single piece of shrapnel through a coolant line could doom an engine within minutes as the coolant drained away and temperatures soared. And losing even one engine on a heavily loaded Halifax often meant losing the aircraft. The power margins were too thin. The remaining three engines couldn't sustain the necessary altitude and speed to escape the defences. But the engine problem was only half of what plagued the early Halifax. The other half was trying to kill pilots who hadn't even reached enemy territory yet. The original tail fin design suffered from a phenomenon called rudder overbalance. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand how a rudder works and why Handley Page's initial design violated the basic principles of control surface aerodynamics. A rudder turns an aircraft by deflecting airflow. Push the left pedal, the rudder swings left. Airflow pushes against it, and the tail swings right, yawing the nose left. Simple enough. But the force required to hold that rudder in position depends on where the aerodynamic center of pressure sits relative to the hinge line. Get that relationship wrong, and the rudder doesn't just respond to pilot input, it fights back. On the early Halifax marks, the original triangular tail fins positioned the rudder's center of pressure too far aft of the hinge line at certain speeds and angles of attack. When a pilot applied rudder at high speed, say during evasive maneuvers to escape a night fighter, the aerodynamic forces on the rudder could suddenly reverse. Instead of the pilot controlling the rudder would snatch, swinging hard in one direction faster than the pilot could react. The physics were brutal. At speeds above 200 miles per hour, the airflow over the rudder's trailing edge created a moment that exceeded the pilot's physical strength on the pedals. The rudder would slam to full deflection. The aircraft would yaw violently, sometimes 30 degrees or more in less than a second. Pilots described the sensation as the aircraft swapping ends, the nose suddenly pointing somewhere completely different from where they intended. Several early Halifax losses were attributed directly to this phenomenon. Aircraft would enter a dive during evasive action. The pilot would apply rudder to correct, and the rudder would snatch in the opposite direction, sending the bomber into an uncontrollable spiral. No enemy action required. The aircraft killed its own crew. Handley Page's engineers knew what was happening. The solution was straightforward in principle. Redesign the fins to move the center of pressure forward relative to the hinge line. This required increasing the fin area ahead of the hinge, essentially making the rudder heavier in aerodynamic terms, so that pilot input dominated the control forces rather than airflow effects. The redesigned rectangular fins, what crews called the D-fins for their shape, solved the problem completely. The new geometry placed the center of pressure where it belonged. The rudder became predictable, responsive, pleasant to fly. Pilots who had cursed the early marks praised the modified aircraft as transformed. But redesigning tail surfaces wasn't like changing a tire. It required wind tunnel testing, structural analysis, flight testing, production retooling, months of work, while Halifax crews continued dying in aircraft with killer rudders. The bureaucratic delays that had forced Merlin engines on the Halifax now compounded. The engineering team was fixing problems that shouldn't have existed, while simultaneously developing the Mark III with the Hercules engines that should have been there from the start. Loss rates climbed through 1942 and into 1943. Harris used those numbers relentlessly in his campaign against Halifax production. Every time he submitted reports to the Air Ministry, he included the loss rate comparisons. Every time he met with procurement officials, he hammered the same point. The Halifax was getting crews killed at higher rates than the Lancaster. Why continue building it? What he never acknowledged, what the Air Ministry understood but couldn't publicly discuss, was that the Halifax's problems were largely problems of specification interference, not fundamental design flaws. Falkert had always wanted the Hercules. The tail problems could be solved with redesign. The aircraft's basic structure was sound. It simply needed the right power plant and some aerodynamic refinement. But fixes took time. Development took time. And in the meantime, Halifax crews were dying at rates that gave ammunition to Harris's campaign. The institutional damage was being done. The Halifax was becoming known as the second best bomber. The aircraft you flew if you couldn't get a Lancaster posting. The machine that was merely adequate when adequacy meant death. The vindication came in late 1943. The Halifax Mark III replaced the Merlin engines with 1,615 horsepower Bristol Hercules 16 radial engines, and featured the redesigned rectangular tail fins that eliminated the rudder overbalance. This was the aircraft George Falkert had always wanted to build. The machine his original specifications had called for before the bureaucrats forced him to accept Merlin's. The Hercules 16 was a powerhouse. Air-cooled, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing significantly more power at altitude than the Merlin variants it replaced. The radial configuration meant no vulnerable coolant lines. Battle damage that would have doomed a Merlin often left a Hercules running. The engine could take punishment and keep flying. The transformation was immediate, dramatic, undeniable. Following the introduction of the Bristol Hercules engines and redesigned tail fins, the Halifax Mark III's loss rate dropped to 1.6% in 1944. 402 aircraft lost in 25,454 sorties. That matched Lancaster survivability levels. The aircraft that Harris had condemned as inefficient and unworthy of continued production was suddenly performing as well as his beloved Lancaster in the most critical metric, the percentage of aircraft returning from missions. British engineering had been right all along. The problem had never been the Halifax's fundamental design. The problem had been bureaucratic interference with sound engineering judgment. But here's the thing. Even while Harris was campaigning against it, even while the early Marks were struggling with underpowered engines and killer rudders, the Halifax was already proving itself irreplaceable for missions the Lancaster simply couldn't perform. These weren't backup duties. These weren't consolation assignments for a second-rate aircraft. These were critical operations where the Halifax was the only option. The first thing the Halifax did that no other British aircraft could: it put tanks on the battlefield from the sky. The General Aircraft Hamilcar was a monster. 68 feet of wingspan, 80 feet long, the largest glider ever operated by British forces. And that size wasn't an accident. It needed to be that big because inside its cavernous hold sat a Tetrarch light tank, or a 17-pounder anti-tank gun with its Morris C8 tractor, or a Bren carrier, the kind of heavy firepower that paratroopers desperately needed when German panzers came hunting. Airborne forces faced a fundamental problem in every operation they conducted. They could drop lightly armed infantry behind enemy lines, seize key objectives, create chaos in rear areas. But the moment the enemy counterattacked with armour, those lightly armed paratroopers were in desperate trouble. A Sten gun doesn't stop a Panzer IV. A Piat anti-tank projector had limited range and required getting dangerously close to enemy armour. What airborne forces needed was real anti-tank capability. Guns heavy enough to kill panzers at meaningful range, or armour of their own to match enemy tanks. The Hamilcar was designed to solve this problem. Load a Tetrarch light tank or a 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the glider's hold, tow the glider to the drop zone, release it to land behind enemy lines. Suddenly, airborne troops had the firepower they needed to survive armoured counterattack. There was just one problem. Loaded, the Hamilcar weighed 36,000 pounds. You cannot simply hook 36,000 pounds of dead weight to any aircraft and expect it to fly. The tow plane needs enormous power to drag that weight off the runway and into the sky. It needs structural strength to handle the stress of that massive glider pulling against it during takeoff, during climb, during every manoeuvre until release. The tow rope doesn't simply trail behind. It transmits forces from the glider's weight and drag directly into the towing aircraft's airframe. The Lancaster couldn't do it. The Stirling couldn't do it. Only the Halifax had the muscle to drag a Hamilcar into the sky and release it over the drop zone. The numbers tell the story. As a glider tug, the Halifax Mark III possessed a tug weight at takeoff of 59,400 pounds, compared to the Lancaster Mark II's 52,800 pounds. That wasn't a marginal difference. That was a decisive capability gap. The Halifax was the most frequently used aircraft for towing the 36,000-pound General Aircraft Hamilcar glider, which carried 17,600-pound military loads, including Tetrarch light tanks and 17-pounder anti-tank guns. When the largest British glider needed to deliver armour to an airborne assault, there was exactly one aircraft that could make it happen. Arthur Harris could have built 1,000 more Lancasters, and not one of them could have replaced this capability. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Halifax aircraft towed Hamilcar gliders carrying Tetrarch tanks and 17-pounders to reinforce the British airborne landings. The 6th Airborne Division's drop zones east of the Orne River needed armour to survive the inevitable German counterattack. At Pegasus Bridge, at the Orne River crossings, British paratroopers seized their objectives in the early hours of June 6th, then waited for the sound of tank engines. When German panzers rolled toward their perimeter, the defenders had 17-pounders waiting, guns capable of punching through the frontal armour of any German tank in Normandy. Every piece of armour that arrived by glider that night came courtesy of an aircraft that Arthur Harris wanted to stop building. 3 months later, Operation Market Garden, the ill-fated assault on Arnhem. Halifax towed Hamilcars delivered 17-pounders to the drop zones, giving trapped paratroopers their only chance against the panzer units converging on their position. And then March 1945. Operation Varsity. The massive Rhine-crossing airborne assault. Over 16,000 paratroopers and glider-borne troops landed east of the Rhine in a single day. Halifax aircraft towed Hamilcar gliders carrying Tetrarch tanks and 17-pounders to landing zones east of the river. German anti-aircraft fire was intense. Several Halifax tugs were shot down over the drop zones, their crews dying to deliver the armour that would secure the eastern bank. In each of these operations, the mission simply could not have been executed without the Halifax. Which brings us to the second thing the Halifax did that no other British aircraft could. It changed the date of D-Day. The invasion of Normandy was the most complex military operation in human history. Nearly 160,000 troops, nearly 7,000 naval vessels, more than 11,000 aircraft. The entire assault depended on one factor no general could control: the weather. Group Captain James Martin Stagg was SHAEF's chief meteorological officer, the man responsible for telling Dwight Eisenhower whether conditions would permit the invasion to proceed. The original date was June 5, 1944. Stagg's job was to predict weather conditions over the English Channel, the Normandy beaches, and the airspace above the assault zones with enough accuracy to give Eisenhower confidence the invasion wouldn't founder in storms. This was 1944. No weather satellites, no computer models, no radar tracking of storm systems crossing the Atlantic. Meteorologists relied on observations from weather stations, ships at sea, and reconnaissance aircraft. They built forecasts from fragmentary data, using experience and intuition as much as science. On the night of June 3rd, a Halifax of 518 Squadron lifted off from Tiree in the Inner Hebrides and flew west into the Atlantic darkness. The aircraft wasn't carrying bombs. It was carrying meteorological instruments, thermometers, barometers, hygrometers, and a crew tasked with flying directly into the weather systems approaching Britain. The pilot climbed through turbulent cloud layers, ice forming on the wings as the Halifax penetrated the storm front. At 18,000 feet, the navigator recorded readings: temperature, pressure, humidity. The wireless operator transmitted coded observations back to the meteorological office at Dunstable. Every 30 minutes, another transmission. Another data point in the vast jigsaw puzzle Stagg was trying to assemble. The Halifax flew for 7 hours through violent turbulence, the crew bouncing against their harnesses as the aircraft bucked through unstable air masses. They weren't dodging flak or evading night fighters. They were measuring the invisible architecture of the atmosphere. the pressure gradients and temperature inversions that would determine whether the invasion lived or died. What they found was crucial. The storm battering the channel wasn't a single continuous front. Behind it, a ridge of high pressure was building over the Atlantic. A gap in the storm, a window that might last 36 hours before the next system arrived. This was the needle in the haystack. The 518 Squadron data identified not just the storm that forced the delay from June 5th, but the subsequent ridge of high pressure that would create the window for June 6th. It wasn't simply about delaying D-Day. It was about finding the brief clearing that would allow the invasion to happen at all. Stagg's American counterparts weren't convinced. The meteorological teams disagreed about the significance of the reconnaissance data. The American forecasters thought any improvement would be minimal, insufficient for the invasion. Stagg argued that his data from aircraft flying through the approaching weather systems, showed a genuine clearing was coming. On June 4th, Stagg faced Eisenhower and the assembled commanders at Southwark House. The immediate forecast was terrible. High winds, low clouds, rough seas. A storm that would make airborne operations impossible, ground fighter cover, turn the beach landings into catastrophe. But Stagg had seen the Halifax data. He had traced the ridge of high pressure moving toward the channel. "I think we have found a gleam of hope for you, sir." Eisenhower made the call. The invasion was delayed 24 hours. June 5th brought exactly the conditions Stagg had predicted. Violent storms that would have scattered the airborne drops across Normandy, grounded close air support, and turned the beach landings into chaos. The German defenders, convinced the weather made invasion impossible, relaxed their vigilance. Rommel left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Several key commanders were away from their posts. When the weather window arrived on June 6th, Allied forces achieved tactical surprise against an enemy who believed no invasion was possible. The weather was still far from perfect, but it was good enough. The invasion succeeded. The data that made that decision possible came from Halifax reconnaissance flights. Not Lancaster flights. Halifax aircraft flying through Atlantic weather systems, gathering the observations that let Stagg see what was coming. That data shaped the most important military decision of the 20th century. And that brings us to the third thing, the one the Air Ministry kept secret from the men who flew. If your bomber got hit over Germany, you were nearly 3 times more likely to survive bailing out of a Halifax than a Lancaster. A 1943 Bomber Command operational research study revealed the numbers. The survival rate of aircrew in shot-down Lancasters was only 11%. In Halifax aircraft, it was 29%. This statistic was deliberately kept from the men who flew these aircraft. The Air Ministry feared, probably correctly, that the knowledge would destroy Lancaster crew morale. Think about what that means. For every 100 men whose Lancaster was shot down, only 11 survived to become prisoners of war or evade capture. 89 died. In the Halifax, 29 survived. Still a terrible number, 71 dead out of every 100 shot down, but nearly 3 times better than the Lancaster. The reasons for this disparity were structural and specific. The Lancaster was difficult to escape from due to a nose emergency hatch measuring only 22 by 26.5 inches and a main spar that ran directly through the middle of the bomb bay, creating a fatal obstruction. When a Lancaster was hit and began its death spiral, crew members in the forward section had to squeeze through a tiny opening barely large enough for a man wearing full flying kit. Picture it. The aircraft is diving, spinning, on fire. Smoke fills the fuselage. You're wearing a Mae West life jacket, a parachute harness, heavy flying boots. You need to get through a hatch that's barely bigger than your shoulders. And you have seconds, maybe less, before the aircraft breaks apart or crashes. And the main wing spar, that massive structural beam that gave the Lancaster its famous bomb-carrying capacity, ran right through the fuselage at a point where crew members needed to pass to reach the rear escape hatch. In a stricken, spinning, burning aircraft, that spar became a death trap. The Halifax, by contrast, featured a roomier interior, escape hatches that were 2 inches wider and better positioned than the Lancasters, and a structurally stronger design intended to break into sections during a crash landing rather than compacting and trapping crew inside. These design features reflected different engineering philosophies. The Lancaster was optimized for bomb-carrying capacity, every cubic inch of fuselage devoted to payload. The Halifax was designed with more attention to crew ergonomics and survivability, decisions that cost bomb capacity but saved lives. 29% versus 11%. Every mission, Halifax crews had nearly 3 times the odds of their Lancaster counterparts of surviving a shoot-down. Harris knew these numbers. The Air Ministry knew these numbers. They kept them secret from the crews and continued lobbying to cancel Halifax production anyway. But Bomber Command wasn't the only organisation flying Halifaxes over hostile territory. And some of the Halifax's most important work happened far from the night skies over Germany. Out in the grey wastes of the Atlantic, a different kind of war was being fought, and the Halifax was fighting it. Coastal Command's war against the U-boats was as critical to British survival as anything Bomber Command did over the Reich. Britain was an island nation dependent on imported food and materiel. Convoys crossing the Atlantic faced wolf packs of German submarines hunting in the darkness. Thousands of merchant sailors died in torpedo explosions and freezing water. If the convoys couldn't get through, Britain would starve. The problem was the mid-Atlantic gap, a vast stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats could hunt with impunity. Shorter-range aircraft could cover the convoy routes near Britain and near North America, but there was a gap in the middle where submarines had free rein. Closing that gap required aircraft with exceptional range and endurance. The Halifax met that requirement. Equipped with ASV radar, air-to-surface vessel detection equipment, and armed with depth charges, Halifax aircraft of Coastal Command flew endless patrols over the Atlantic. 12-hour missions, 14-hour missions. Hour after hour of scanning grey waves for the telltale wake of a submarine or the flash of a periscope. Tedium punctuated by moments of violent action. On October 8, 1943, a Halifax of 502 Squadron was patrolling the Bay of Biscay when the radar operator picked up a contact. The aircraft descended through cloud cover and found U-419 running on the surface, charging her batteries. The U-boat captain saw the Halifax at the same moment and began an emergency dive, but he was too late. The Halifax pilot, Flying Officer John Wright, brought the aircraft down to 50 feet off the waves and released a stick of depth charges as the submarine's conning tower disappeared beneath the surface. The charges straddled the diving boat. Seconds later, the sea erupted in a boiling mass of oil, debris, and air bubbles. U-419 was gone. 49 men killed by an aircraft Arthur Harris wanted to stop building. This wasn't an isolated incident. Halifax aircraft of Coastal Command sank or damaged dozens of U-boats throughout the war. They couldn't do it alone. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by a combination of improved radar, code-breaking, escort carriers, and long-range aircraft. But the Halifax's contribution was substantial. The aircraft's range made it invaluable for closing the mid-Atlantic gap. Modified for maritime patrol with additional fuel tanks, the Halifax could stay airborne for over 12 hours, covering vast stretches of ocean that shorter-range aircraft couldn't reach. U-boats that had once operated with near impunity in the mid-Atlantic suddenly found themselves vulnerable to air attack at any time. The crews who flew these patrols rarely received the recognition given to Bomber Command. Their missions weren't photographed for propaganda purposes. They didn't feature in newsreels or morale-boosting broadcasts. They simply flew, hour after hour, watching and waiting, knowing that their presence alone was forcing U-boats to stay submerged, where they were slow, blind, and unable to attack convoys effectively. It was warfare by presence, by endurance, by the simple fact that a Halifax over the Atlantic meant a U-boat captain had to think twice before surfacing. And then there were the missions that nobody talked about at all. Special Operations Executive, SOE, ran Britain's campaign of sabotage and subversion across occupied Europe. They recruited agents, trained them in the dark arts of espionage, and dropped them behind enemy lines to organize resistance movements, gather intelligence, and make life miserable for German occupiers. Getting those agents into occupied territory required aircraft. Not just any aircraft capable of flying long distances at night, navigating to precise drop zones in hostile territory, and delivering their human cargo without being detected. The Halifax became SOE's preferred transport for clandestine operations. On the night of February 17, 1944, a Halifax of 138 Squadron lifted off from RAF Tempsford in Bedfordshire. Tempsford was a secret base, its very existence classified. The aircraft carried no bombs. Instead, the cargo consisted of 3 agents of the Norwegian resistance and 12 containers of weapons, explosives and supplies. The Halifax flew north, crossing the North Sea at low altitude to avoid German radar. The pilot climbed to clear the Norwegian mountains, then descended into a valley where a reception committee waited with signal lamps. The drop zone was a frozen lake, the only flat surface for miles in the rugged terrain. The dispatcher in the Halifax's fuselage watched for the signals. 3 lights in a row, flashing the correct code letter. He opened the hatch, and the agents jumped into the darkness. The containers followed, parachutes blooming white against the black sky. Within minutes, the Halifax was climbing away, heading back toward Britain, while Norwegian resistance fighters gathered their supplies below. This scene repeated hundreds of times throughout the war. Halifax aircraft dropped agents and supplies to resistance movements in France, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The aircraft's range allowed it to reach deep into occupied territory. Its relatively spacious fuselage accommodated the bulky containers of weapons and equipment that resistance fighters needed. Its crews developed expertise in the demanding art of night navigation to pinpoint drop zones. The pilots who flew these missions couldn't talk about what they did. The agents they dropped couldn't be acknowledged. The resistance fighters who received the supplies operated in shadows, knowing that capture meant torture and death. So.'s war was a secret war, and the Halifax was its silent partner. Not every mission succeeded. Aircraft were shot down, agents were captured, drop zones were compromised by German intelligence. But the cumulative effect of SOE's operations, tying down German troops, disrupting supply lines, providing intelligence, contributed to Allied victory in ways that bombing tonnage statistics couldn't measure. When the French resistance rose against German occupation in the days before and after D-Day, they did so with weapons dropped by Halifax aircraft. When Norwegian resistance fighters sabotaged the heavy water plant at Vemork, denying Germany materials for atomic weapons research, they were supported by supplies delivered by Halifax. When partisans in Yugoslavia tied down entire German divisions, They fought with guns and explosives that had floated down under silk canopies from aircraft that Arthur Harris wanted to cancel. Harris never mentioned SOE operations in his arguments against Halifax production. They weren't his concern. He cared about bombing tonnage, about the weight of destruction that could be delivered to German cities. Clandestine operations didn't appear in his statistics, but they appeared in the war's outcome. The Royal Canadian Air Force understood the Halifaxes' value, even when it was still struggling with the early Marks problems. No. 6 Group RCAF operated as part of Bomber Command from bases across Yorkshire. Canadian crews flew both Lancasters and Halifaxes, but for much of the war, the Canadian squadrons were equipped primarily with Halifaxes. The reasons were partly practical. Halifax production was more readily available when the Canadian squadrons were forming, and partly political. Canada was a sovereign ally, not a colonial possession. Canadian leaders wanted their airmen equipped and operational as quickly as possible. They weren't going to wait for Lancaster allocations when Halifax airframes were available. So Canadian crews strapped into Halifax cockpits and flew the same missions as their RAF counterparts into the same deadly skies over Germany. They suffered through the same problems: the underpowered Merlin engines, the dangerous handling characteristics. Canadian crews died at the same elevated rates as everyone else flying those compromised early Marks. By July 1943, statistics revealed that 6 Group morale was shaky. The combination of high losses and the knowledge that they were flying inferior aircraft took a psychological toll. The Canadian squadrons were concentrated in the least desirable bases, given the most dangerous routes, equipped with the least capable aircraft. Some of this was operational necessity. The Canadians were the newest group, still working out the problems that come with any new formation. But some of it felt like institutional neglect. The transformation came with the Mark III. When Canadian squadrons received Halifax Mark IIIs with Hercules engines and redesigned tails, the change was dramatic. Loss rates dropped. Crews gained confidence. The aircraft they had cursed became an aircraft they trusted. By 1944, No. 6 Group was performing as well as any formation in Bomber Command. Thousands of young men from Montreal and Toronto, from Vancouver and Halifax and Calgary, flew into the night skies over Germany in Halifaxes. They didn't care about Harris's production statistics. They cared about getting home alive. And the Halifax, especially the Mark III, gave them better odds than they might have had otherwise. The Canadian contribution to Bomber Command's offensive was substantial. By war's end, No. 6 Group had flown over 40,000 sorties and dropped more than 125,000 tons of bombs. Not all of those sorties were in Halifaxes. The group transitioned to Lancasters late in the war. But the Halifax was the aircraft that saw the Canadian squadrons through their most difficult period. The aircraft that was there when they needed it, even if it wasn't the aircraft they would have chosen. So why did Britain keep building both aircraft? It was deemed more efficient for factories to keep building Halifaxes than to halt production to retool for a different aircraft. The Halifax was manufactured by multiple companies across Britain: English Electric, Fairey, Roots, the London Aircraft Production Group. Each factory had established supply chains, trained workers, specialised tooling. Shutting down these production lines would have caused months of disruption. But that's not the whole story. The Air Ministry understood something Harris refused to accept. Bomber Command was not the only customer for 4-engined aircraft. Coastal Command needed long-range maritime patrol aircraft. Airborne forces required glider tugs. SOE demanded aircraft for clandestine operations. Transport Command needed cargo haulers. The Halifax, with its versatile design and different operational characteristics, filled roles the Lancaster couldn't match. Harris saw only bombing tonnage. The Air Ministry saw a more complex picture of a war requiring many different capabilities. The men who flew Halifaxes weren't flying inferior aircraft by 1944. They were flying the Mark III, the machine George Volkert had always intended to build. The aircraft with the Hercules engines, the aircraft with the redesigned tail fins, the aircraft with loss rates matching the Lancasters. These crews knew their bomber's reputation. They knew the Lancaster got the glory. The Lancaster breached the Myrna and Ada dams. The Lancaster sank the Tirpitz. The Lancaster dropped the Grand Slam earthquake bombs. When people thought of Bomber Command, they thought of Lancasters. The Halifax lived in the Lancaster's shadow. It didn't get the same press coverage. It didn't inspire the same romantic admiration. But Halifax crews knew things the public didn't. They knew about the escape hatches. They knew about the survivability. They knew their aircraft could do things the Lancaster couldn't. No Halifax crew towing a Hamilcar over Normandy thought they were flying an inferior machine. No Halifax crew hunting U-boats in the Atlantic thought they were wasting their time. No Halifax crew dropping SOE agents into occupied France thought they should have been somewhere else. No Halifax crew that successfully bailed out over Germany wished they had been in a Lancaster instead. The Halifax had its own mythology among the men who flew it. The Friday the 13th Halifax of 158 Squadron flew 128 operations, more than any other Halifax in the war. Other aircraft achieved similar longevity, proving that the Halifax, properly maintained and properly flown, was as capable of surviving the bomber war as any aircraft in the inventory. Arthur Harris never admitted he was wrong. He went to his grave believing the Halifax was a waste of resources. His memoirs repeated the same statistics he had cited during the war, the same arguments for substituting Lancasters for Halifaxes. He couldn't see, or refused to see, the broader picture of a war requiring capabilities beyond strategic bombing. Harris was a zealot. He believed in area bombing with religious fervour. Every aircraft, every mission, every resource should serve the goal of burning German cities. Capabilities that didn't contribute weren't his concern. The Halifax could tow gliders? Irrelevant. The Halifax could hunt U-boats? Not his department. The Halifax gave crews better survival odds. The mission was what mattered, not the men. This tunnel vision made Harris effective in some ways. His single-minded focus drove Bomber Command to deliver unprecedented destruction on German industry and cities. But it also blinded him to broader requirements. D-Day couldn't succeed without airborne operations. Airborne operations couldn't succeed without heavy gliders. Heavy gliders couldn't fly without Halifax tugs. The Air Ministry saw it. Despite Harris's relentless lobbying, they kept the Halifax in production. They understood that winning the war required more than burning cities. It required putting tanks in Normandy. It required accurate weather forecasting. It required giving young men a chance to survive when their aircraft was hit. It required hunting U-boats. It required arming resistance movements. The Halifax did all of that. 6,178 aircraft, 82,000 sorties with Bomber Command alone, plus thousands more with Coastal Command, Transport Command and Special Operations. 224,000 tons of bombs. Less than the Lancaster, yes, but 224,000 tons is not a small number. Hamilcar gliders towed to D-Day, Market Garden and Varsity. U-boats sunk in the Atlantic. Agents dropped behind enemy lines. Weather data that shaped the most important decision of the war. The Halifax doesn't need to be better than the Lancaster to deserve recognition. It doesn't need inflated claims about payload capacity or operational superiority. The honest history is more interesting than the myths. George Falkirk's vindication came too late for the men who died flying the early Marks. Those crews deserved the Mark III from the start. They deserved the Hercules engines Falkirk had always specified. They deserved an aircraft that performed as intended, not machines compromised by bureaucratic interference. We can't change what happened. We can only remember it accurately. The Lancaster dropped more bombs. The Halifax saved more lives. Both statements are true. Both matter. The young men who flew Halifaxes over Germany, over the Atlantic, over occupied Europe, they don't need us to pretend their aircraft was the better bomber. They need us to remember what it actually did. The tanks it delivered to Normandy, the weather data it gathered over the Atlantic, the U-boats it sank, the agents it dropped into darkness, the 29% who survived when everything went wrong instead of 11%. British engineering was right all along. When the Mark III finally received the Bristol Hercules engines that George Falkirk had always specified, the aircraft proved itself. The years of institutional prejudice, the higher loss rates of the early Marks, the reputation as second best, all of it stemmed from decisions made in committee rooms, overruling an engineer who understood what his aircraft needed. When Falkirk finally got his engines, the Halifax vindicated him completely. There's a lesson in that story beyond aviation history. Expertise matters. Engineers who understand their designs shouldn't be overruled by bureaucrats pursuing standardization for its own sake. The men who paid the price for that lesson, the Halifax crews who died in early Marks, struggling with underpowered engines and dangerous handling, deserved better. The Halifax was never supposed to be the Lancaster. It was supposed to be something different, a versatile, heavy aircraft designed with attention to crew survivability that the Lancaster's bomb bay optimized design couldn't match. For years, bureaucratic interference prevented it from performing as intended. When the interference ended, it proved its designers right. The Lancaster dropped 608,000 tons of bombs. The Halifax dropped 224,000. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. But the Lancaster never put a tank on a battlefield from the sky. The Lancaster never gathered the weather data that saved D-Day. The Lancaster never gave its crews nearly 3 times the odds of surviving a shoot-down. Those are the facts. They're specific, they're verifiable, and they're more interesting than any inflated claim ever was. The Halifax deserves to be remembered, not as the Lancaster's inferior sibling, not as a failed bomber that should have been cancelled, but as what it actually was. A versatile, capable, life-saving aircraft that performed irreplaceable missions in the most important operations of the Second World War. That's the honest history. And in the end, the honest history is always the one worth telling. Subscribe for more stories like this.